Hello, and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. As you can see, I'm running solo today, and it is a Friday, so we're going to be taking some questions from the audience. This Friday, I want to talk a little bit about, from a GM perspective, about villains. We've got the party engaged in some trouble with their adversaries right now, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about villains, how villains can be used, how I'm trying to use villains. I'm particularly in Khyber Shards because of the comic book inspirations and because this is a big theme that Keith Baker talks about for Eberron a lot. I'm trying very hard to make sure that I have recurring villains. This is really quite hard to do in D&D, and not every D&D game needs to do this. I mean, if you're playing a really classic D&D dungeon crawler, you don't necessarily, you can have recurring villains in those cases, but you don't necessarily need recurring villains. But for the kind of game that I'm running, that is very inspired by comic books, that's very relationshipy, that's very personal, you want to make your villain not be just some sort of faceless dark lord. That kind of villain works better in a very, very different kind of game. So I'm trying to really work on recurring characters. So I want to talk a little bit about how I'm doing that and what I'm trying to do so far. Obviously, in Khyber Shards right now, we have a few different people that could be categorized as recurring villains. The two main ones at the moment would be Tommel and Falco. Falco, we've really only encountered pretty briefly, but apparently my handful of lines from Falco made a super serious impression on the players. And so bringing him back made a lot of sense. I probably, if I'm being real honest, brought him back a little earlier than I ought to have. But bringing him back made sense, and the players have reacted strongly to him. And so the presence of Falco in the story hasn't really paid off with where we are yet, but that's one character who could be described as a recurring villain. And then the character of Tommel, of course. Tommel's a little bit different because there's a degree to which the player characters, I'm not sure about the players, but there's a degree to which the player characters don't really want to think about Tommel as a villain right now, or perhaps not as an enemy. I guess I should distinguish here. Enemy is just the player's adversaries, the people who are in opposition to the player's goals. Villain is someone with a goal that the players would oppose. And that can be distinct. A villain isn't necessarily opposing the players. In theory, your player characters are going to oppose their villain. Unless you're playing an evil campaign where your characters are the villains. That's an entirely different thing. That's not what we're talking about right now. So how do you go about designing a good villain? Well, there are a few different ways to think about villains. You can kind of try to categorize villains in a few different ways. One way you can categorize villains is in the way that we, the audience, the reader, the players, feel about them. Are they sympathetic? Are they an anti-hero? You know, someone whose goals we agree with, but whose methods we might find a little troubling. Are they a tragic villain? Someone who was driven to this by circumstances beyond their control. Someone like Mr. Freeze or Gollum. You know, there's tragic heroes or tragic villains who are villains, but we feel for them. We understand where they're coming from. And again, that's an audience reaction. It can also be a character reaction, but it is primarily an audience reaction. And then, of course, you have unsympathetic villains. These are villains that it's very easy to hate. You want to enjoy hating them. This might be a villain who's just a psychopath, like a lot of interpretations of the Joker. He's just a madman. Some people just like to watch the world burn. And we're not meant to feel any sympathy for him. We're meant to be frightened by him. He's alarming. He's entirely unsympathetic. You can kind of do the same thing with monsters. If you watch the original Predator or Alien movies, we're not supposed to feel any sympathy for those monsters. They're just dangers to be faced. But I would argue those are probably not really villains. but that's an entirely different conversation. And then another kind of unsympathetic villain is like the Dark Lord, Sauron, Voldemort, the super powerful being who's behind it all. These are good villains for really epic campaigns. They're bad villains for really personal campaigns. I'm not using Dark Lords or great conquerors. You see these a lot in comic books. Person shows up, intent to conquer the world. Alien movies, aliens show up, intent to conquer the world. We resist them. The Galactic Empire intends to conquer the galaxy. The plucky rebellion resists them. We're not supposed to feel sympathy for the Empire. We might feel sympathy for Darth Vader once we know the backstory, but we're not feeling sympathy for the Empire as an entity. It's bad. And we're not feeling sympathy for the Emperor as a Dark Lord. He's just bad, and we're okay with that. Nothing about him is good. So we could categorize our villains by the way that we're intended to feel about them. And I tend to like sympathetic villains, but there is something very useful, especially in Dungeons & Dragons, about unsympathetic villains. If you are going to have a sympathetic villain, and we haven't yet seen whether Tommel is sympathetic, because we haven't really seen how Tommel became the way that he is. So we'll table that conversation. I know there's some opinions among the viewers, but whether he is or not, if you're gonna let's suppose that he is, though. Suppose that we learn about Tommel and find that he's very, very sympathetic. He's driven to this. This wasn't his intention. That's fun and interesting narratively. But there is a degree to which in D&D you want to be able to just smash. So you also want to have some unsympathetic villains. You also want to have some villains that the players can just hate. So as things stand right now, let's suppose that Tommel has the potential to be a sympathetic enemy. As things stand right now, Falco does not. Falco's easy to hate. Falco was verbally abusive to the player characters back in session 0. Falco is a member of this program that did so much harm and trauma to these characters. Falco is someone who's easy to put into that unsympathetic category. And that's someone that the players can have no qualms about taking down, about showing no quarter to, maybe even, but about hating. Their characters might have different reactions, but the players aren't going to have a problem with this. You want to have both of those things to give the players a little bit of relief from the moral challenge that comes with dealing with sympathetic villains. So how we feel about them is one way. Another way we can categorize a villain is what they do. Are they a plotter? They're the mastermind behind the scenes. Are they Lex Luthor? Are they a killer? Is this Bane or Sabretooth? Is this a villain who's coming straight at the heroes with murder in their eyes? Are they a trickster? Loki, right? Are they a trickster whose goal is to demonstrate their superior intellect to the villains? Loki, the Riddler, that sort of thing. There's a lot more. We could create a really, really long list of what they do categorizations. But that's another way we can categorize our villain, is what do they do? And that's going to tell us how are they going to try to achieve their goals. It's also going to give us some clues as to what kind of goals that villain would have, because a villain needs goals. We want the villain to have goals so that the villain feels alive. Now, again, if we're just running a simple dungeon crawler, then the villain's goal might be don't let the heroes steal their treasure. If you look at The Hobbit, Smaug is a villain. He's not sympathetic. He's got one goal: keep all his treasure, kill anyone who tries to take his treasure. He's very, very simple. Nothing sympathetic about him. We're not going to get a live action remake where we learn that Smaug was really driven to it by his tragic past. That's just not in the cards for that character. He's easy to hate. So again, if we're doing some kinds of stories, don't need really complicated goals. So a villain doesn't have to have complicated goals, but a villain does have to have goals. Otherwise, they're going to feel like just a cardboard punching bag. that doesn't make any sense. Cardboard punching bag, who does that? They're going to feel flat. They're going to feel simple. And then a third way that I like to categorize my villain is their relation to the characters. Are they the characters opposite, or are they the characters dark mirror? You look at, in our game, let's take Tommel again, and let's just categorize Tommel in these ways. Tommel, we don't really know whether Tommel is sympathetic or unsympathetic yet. So we don't yet know how we feel about Tommel. But we probably haven't decided as an audience that he's entirely unsympathetic. We don't know what has happened. We don't know how he got here. What does he do? What is Tommel? Right now, it seems that Tommel is probably a killer. Tommel seems, he's not trying to kill the heroes yet, but Tommel seems like someone who solves his problems. In fact, he's said he's quite eager to get into fights with the dragon marked houses. Tommel solves his problems through violence. He achieves his goals through violence and the threat of violence, through force and the threat of force, not necessarily just violence. And then what is his relationship to the player characters? Well, he's probably in that dark mirror category. He's not really the opposite of the player characters because they can see themselves in it. They can see in Tommel where they might be given a different path. You know, Tommel is there, but for the grace of God go I, when they look at him. Excuse me. So we can categorize in those ways. There are other ways we can categorize, but for the purposes here, this is sort of my flow chart. I want to know, how are we going to feel? How do I want my players to feel about the villain? What's the villain's relationship to the characters? And what does the villain do? How does the villain try to achieve their goals? So that's step one. Then, using the villain. That's, you know, how we're designing a villain. We're working out those things about the villain, and then we put flesh on it with, you know, we want to know what do they look like, what are their powers, what are their abilities, that sort of thing. And what are their goals? Because especially recurring villains have to have goals that they're working towards. And then of note, I'm going to want to design a certain amount of progression into a recurring villain. Assuming Tommel remains an adversary, assuming the player characters aren't able to redeem Tommel or something like that, and he remains an adversary to them, over time, Tommel is going out, he's achieving goals, he's finding treasure, he's going on quests. Tommel's going to level up. So I need to think about a progression of, right now, at this level, what's Tommel's CR, what's Tommel's challenge rating, and what are his abilities? And how is that going to change as the campaign progresses, as long as he remains a part of it? Because he's going to go on, he's going to do things, he's going to try to accomplish goals, and he's going to level up. So what's his progression going to look like? I don't necessarily have to design that right at the beginning, but I should have some thought of, well, how Tommel's mark might grow, or what sort of class abilities I might steal and add to Tommel in an attempt to power him up over time. So think about that, but not necessarily create him at multiple levels right off the bat. So let's talk a little about using villains. So one of the things you've got to do ahead of a boss fight, ahead of the showdown with the villain, is the villain's presence needs to be made known. And this is harder or easier depending on the type of villain. So how much time they spend on stage depends on whether your villain is a direct actor, like Tommel. We've seen Tommel going out and actually doing his own dirty work. So Tommel is a direct actor. It's pretty easy to make Tommel's presence felt. We just need to make the player characters run into him. Right? Have the player characters run into him for various reasons. Have him force the player characters to do things. Have him threaten the player characters' goals at various points. Very easy to do. But there's another kind of villain that's very, very good, that we might refer to as a hidden hand kind of villain, someone who acts behind the scenes. So we could say, because we haven't really know much about this character yet, we don't really know much about this character yet, Mirren, this mysterious figure that Tommel reports to. Mirren is our hidden hand villain right now. Mirren, she's an unknown. Her presence is felt through Tommel. Tommel's essentially her lieutenant. So if we got past Tommel, we might get to Mirren. Or if we could convince Tommel to talk, we might learn about Mirren and what she really is, or who she really is, or any of these other things. So we want to make the characters' presence known. We want to make the villain's presence known, either by direct action or by the actions of their minions. But if you're going with minions, you need to find opportunities for their overlord to be present in the story. If you're using, if you're playing an RPG of G.I. Joe and you're fighting Cobra, well, Cobra Commander doesn't have to show up in every fight, but we need to know about him. We need to know about his presence. There are a few different ways you can do this. One is to have the subordinates of the overlord, of the hidden hand, talk about it or not. If you've watched the Netflix Daredevil series, the way that Kingpin is very, very slowly in the background. Before you ever see him on the screen, he's got a presence. Even though no one says his name, he's got a presence. And that works by having people talk about him. Another thing you can do that doesn't get used a lot in RPGs, or in tabletop RPGs, is you can do cutscenes. You can jump to meanwhile and jump over to Cobra's base and give us a little piece of what Cobra Commander is up to, what's going on over there. That's tricky because you don't necessarily want to give the player characters too much information, but I tend to like a little bit of dramatic irony. I tend to like situations where my players know more than their characters and have to stretch themselves in order to act within what their characters know without cheating, without using their outside knowledge. I think that's fun. I think it creates some really good character moments, and it's fun. Well, in my experience, it has been fun for players that I've had. Your players may hate it. As with all DM advice that I give, your mileage may vary. But either way, if you're playing with a hidden hand kind of villain, their presence needs to be felt in the story. You need to make the characters go, who's really behind this? Or who is that person? Or something like that. The player characters, and as importantly, the players, have to want to find out who the hidden hand is, if that's the kind of villain that you're working with. So you need to make the presence known, and you need to make the presence known before the eventual confrontation. If it's a hidden hand villain, you need to make it known well before the players have any kind of confrontation with them, because they'll presumably have multiple confrontations, because recurring villain, right? Next, your villain, when encountered, needs to be vocal. Your villain needs to have personality, voice, ideas. They need to express their goals and intentions. They need to express their position and why they think they're right, because no one is the villain of their own story. You need to think why they think they're right, why they think the player characters are wrong, or stupid, or even evil. Why they think the player characters are the bad guys in some cases. This is hard. I'll be honest with you. This is hard. It's easier if you can come up with opportunities for the player characters to talk to the villain outside of combat. Once you're in combat, you're thinking about the next turn. You're thinking about what powers the villain is going to use. You're thinking about that sequence of events. You're reacting to what the player characters have just done. It's very hard to remember to keep villains vocal in combat. If you're good at that, kudos to you. One thing that can be done, I'm not very good about doing this. One thing that can be done is you can sketch out a few things for the villain to say during the course of combat. If you're actually trying to communicate information to your players, you should absolutely do this, and have the key things that the villain needs to say in combat sketched out somewhere and make sure that they say those things. If you're just trying to make the villain vocal so they have personality, a few random phrases, not necessarily random, but a few relevant phrases can be sufficient. And just sprinkle them in as combat goes on, in reaction to things that the players do, or between turns, or during their turn. If you like to improv, I do, You can also, on your monster card for the villain, whenever you create a stat block for that villain, sketch out what's the sequence they're going to do. What are they going to do on round 1, round 2, round 3? Beyond that, you're probably going to be in such a weird situation you can't plan it, but that will take some of the pressure of that off and allow you to think about being the character and role-playing. If a villainous character is not a frontline combatant, this can be easier because they can be standing in the background commanding their minions or inspiring their minions or throwing spells. And it's a little easier to think through what they're going to say when they're not in the middle of a fight. But either way, do what you can to make your villain vocal. And a lot of times that's going to mean you need to come up with ways for the characters to encounter the villain and speak with the villain outside of combat. This is delicate and tricky because a lot of times your party will want to attack the villain at the first opportunity that they have, especially if they know that villain is a villain. One way to do this is to put them in one of two situations, either in a situation where they know they can't win, Tommel, or put them in a situation where open violence is nearly unthinkable. You encounter the villain at a party where there are a lot of civilians around, and they can't just go right up and murder them. You can also give the villain a good cover in some cases. You think about characters like Lex Luthor, who Clark Kent might encounter in his role as journalist in various occasions. Wilson Fisk, also a good example there. Wilson Fisk Kingpin, also a very good example. Matt Murdock or Peter Parker might encounter him around town, but since no one else knows the truth about that character, they cannot openly attack them. And that's another good way to protect your villain and give opportunities for them to interact with the player characters outside of combat. Combat really shouldn't be your only interaction with your villain. Otherwise, your villain's almost certainly going to get killed. Combat is just too unpredictable. You need to find opportunities where you can have a peaceable conversation with your players as the villain. So villains should be vocal. Villains should either have or develop a relationship with the characters. That's really what we're trying to do through multiple encounters and through non-combat encounters with the villain, is we're trying to build up a relationship. Probably an adversarial relationship. Sometimes things go differently, but probably an adversarial relationship, one where the villain is obviously working against the characters, but you want opportunities for the villain to express their viewpoint, the characters to express their viewpoint, and for them to develop a certain degree of relationship, whether that is a sort of cat and mouse, this is a big chess game relationship, or just pure blind hatred of the villain. You're trying to build a relationship. That's why the villain is recurring. If the villain is not recurring, then you're probably not going to build much of a relationship with the villain. Again, big giant epic campaigns with a Dark Lord, things go very differently. But for the purposes of a very personal campaign like what I'm running with Khyber Shards, need the villain to build that relationship. And then, frankly, most importantly, for the recurrence factor, the villain needs to be durable. The villain needs some pretty strong narrative armor. So how do you do this? One way is you make the villain genuinely durable. You give the villain a lot of hit points, or ways to recover hit points rapidly in the middle of combat. Another is henchmen. You give the villain lots of henchmen and use them to protect the villain in the midst of combat. Matthew Colville's action-oriented monster rules that you can find all sorts of versions of on Reddit, and you can find YouTube videos where he's talked about those. They're a great way to do this because you can let the villain take action. It gives the villain kind of what are sort of like legendary actions. It gives the villain actions between combat in reaction to the player actions, and it can really help make the villain a lot more durable and overcome the action economy to prevent your villain from getting killed right off the bat. And then you can also build in escape hatches. So let's suppose your player characters are fighting with their villain and their villain is trapped. You don't have any good way to get out of this encounter. They've managed to corner the villain in a building that there's no obvious escape from. This is not a villain where it's plausible that they are just packing a prepared spell of teleport or plane shift or dimension door or something like that. Or you've got player characters who are going to be able to counterspell those things. These are real possibilities. Your player characters strike the finishing blow in some really big dramatic way. Maybe if they cast a big spell, you have the building collapse, burying everyone. And when they dig through the rubble, they can find the villain's body. Maybe the villain's henchmen show up at just the right moment to give the villain time to escape. Maybe the villain can pull something where the player characters have to choose between chasing the villain, chasing them, or rescuing civilians who are endangered by something the villain has done. So the villain is cornered, the players are here, and so the villain, rather than attacking the players, the villain throws a fireball over at the corner of another building, destabilizing it so that it's going to fall, and unless the player characters rush over there to do something about it, it will fall and into the marketplace and crush dozens and dozens of people. If your player characters are heroic, they'll probably choose to go rescue the civilians, giving your villain the opportunity to escape. Build in escape hatches. When you're planning an encounter with the villain, figure out what are your escape hatches, and I recommend more than one. Do your best to make them very plausible, but there is a degree to which this is not. If you have developed a good, healthy, non-adversarial relationship with your players, they're going to accept this. They're going to accept that the villain has escape hatches until the climactic fight, until the story earns that climactic fight. Now, sometimes you're just going to have to yield. Sometimes your players are going to be too clever. They're going to plan too well. They're really going to trap your villain, and you can't do anything short of a super obvious Deus Ex Machina kind of thing. You just can't rescue your villain. That happens. And sometimes you just need to let it happen. Sometimes your villain dies early. You just need to be okay with that. There can be consequences of that. Maybe they meet the villain's boss or apprentice. But sometimes that's going to happen, and you just got to be ready to deal with it. But as much as possible, build in some escape hatches to allow your villain the opportunity to recur. Otherwise, they're not recurring. Anyway, so those are some of my thoughts on designing villains. We have a few questions from our community that I wanted to get through here. So we will start with some questions from Eric, not the Eric who plays in this game, the other Eric, as he's known on our Discord. Eric asks, Philip, what plane would you most like to visit if you could, and why? Solanas, probably the Feywild. I like fairy stories. I like fantasy. I like talking animals. I like elves and pixies and Eladrin and the Archfey. I like all of those story elements, and I like story. And also, of the planes, it's the one I feel like I would have a good chance of escaping or of surviving as long as I could identify the kind of story that this layer of Thelanis is in. So I feel reasonably confident in how to survive in Thelanis, and I like the atmosphere of Thelanis. Devious Pop-Tart asks, what are some of your favorite villains? Further, what guidelines do you follow when creating villains? Well, I've just talked about guidelines I follow when creating villains. So there you go. What are some of my favorite villains? I like sympathetic villains. I like tragic villains too. Loki, as he's been done in the MCU, is one of my favorite villains. I think Thanos is quite a good villain also. Gollum, to the degree that you call him a villain, is beautiful and tragic and sad, and I love it. Within comic books, I would say I'm a big fan of Magneto, Apocalypse, for a very different reason in terms of Apocalypse. Magneto obviously is somewhat sympathetic and tragic. Apocalypse is not so much. Mr. Sinister, also outstanding villain, because you could just hate him. You could just hate him. I mean, he has a tragic backstory, and so there was some sympatheticness at one point in his backstory, but by the time you encounter him in comics, he's just, come on, he's just evil, right? He's just evil. So those are some of my favorite villains. I tend to like sympathetic ones. I tend to like ones that are tragic, that you can kind of understand where they're coming from and that you feel for them. Next up, I have a couple of questions from Adam that were seconded from RA that were seconded by members of our community. So I guess I've never said players can't ask questions for these. So here we go. So RA asks, separate from whatever the players might throw at you, do you see this campaign extending beyond Stormreach? I have a couple of adventures in mind, in my head, that are sort of loosely sketched that would take the player characters beyond Stormreach on missions, potentially, or on missions might not be the right word, but to accomplish things. So there are some things that the player characters might want to accomplish or oppose that would take them beyond Stormreach. And then, of course, there are lots of things that could take them out into the jungle beyond Stormreach. So I think the campaign could move to where things occur outside of Stormreach and even outside of Zendrick. I'm not sure that the center of the campaign is likely to move beyond Stormreach, again, barring actions by the player characters, which are always unpredictable and must always be accounted for. RA also says, you GM like a lot. That's true. Do you prefer being a GM or a player? Are you getting anything unique out of GMing in public, so to speak? It's hard to say. I really do like being a player. I like GMing and I like being a player. I wouldn't want to not GM at all, but I would be okay GMing less and getting to play more. So right now, my GM to player ratio is probably 60, 40, 70, 30 in favor of GM. I would be okay with that ratio shifting. But I like GMing a lot. I take a great deal of fun in it. I enjoy crafting story, and I enjoy interacting with my players from that perspective. So I like them both. I think most GMs wish they could be a player a little more often. Am I getting anything unique out of GMing in public? I'm trying to quantify it. I'm sure that I am. It's probably not that different from what I get out of playing in public on the podcast. I'm aware of the audience, and when things happen in the game, I think about how is the audience going to react sometimes. I try not to seek out reviews or take bad comments to heart. I'm not really as open to criticism as some people who do this are, and maybe not as much as I should be. So I don't tend to take those things too much to heart, but I am much more aware of the audience, and I think about it a little bit more in my planning, and I think about it a little bit more after a session where I think, oh man, people are going to just hate that, or people are going to be confused by that, or that sort of thing. Yeah, so that makes it sound bad, but I'm a little more aware of things. I have a little bit of a heightened awareness of what's happening and how things can be interpreted. And that's probably making me a more thoughtful GM. That's probably making me a little bit more thoughtful in my planning and thoughtful in my reactions to things. I'm probably also getting a little better at making sure that each character gets spotlight moments. That's a lot more noticeable when I'm rewatching things or re-listening to things. So I like to I like to think that I'm getting better at making sure that the spotlight gets shared than it sometimes is than you can sometimes fall into. There was some discussion of GMing by improv, which I do a lot. Richard asks, how does this improv style of GMing work when you are co-DMing? Me and Eric, as we talked about back on the knowledge check when we were doing that frequently, co-DM'd a big long campaign, our first real D&D campaign. And we co-DM'd a campaign for about 3 years, and we both really liked co-DMing. I really didn't I really didn't run games in the same kind of improvisational way that I do today back then. I am much more improvisational and much more confident in making it up as I go along than I was back then. Like then I planned things much more thoroughly in advance. So right now I'm not co-DMing. I haven't really, me and Eric briefly co-DM'd a couple of other things, but I haven't really gotten to co-DM much since then. Excuse me. It's late. Sorry. So I'm not sure how it would go. I will say my improvisational style got me in trouble a couple of times with Eric. I once killed an NPC that he had plans for. I didn't know he had plans for because we didn't share everything with each other because we were also playing in the game. So I can see how making it up as I go along, well, making up things in sessions in the moment could create trouble for a co-GM, and I have to be a little more careful about it. But I have not done that since I became a much more improvisational GM, so I don't know. Richard continues, are you able to keep your main plots? I recall your planning of your home game finale on the knowledge check. Is that the most you've planned in advance for a session? Second question first. Yes, by far the most advanced I've planned for a session was the grand finale of my Mummy's Mask campaign, which ended a couple of years ago. So yes, absolutely, that was the most I planned in advance. I was planning that session for several months in advance. I had the basic sketch of it. I was probably actually working in earnest on it for a few weeks ahead of time. But yes, that is definitely the farthest I've ever planned a session in advance. Are you able to keep your main plots? Sometimes, sometimes the player characters just aren't really engaged with it. Sometimes they just don't engage with what you're putting out there, and trying to force them into that path, it's not going to feel good. It's not going to be narratively satisfying, and unless you adapt to something they're more interested in, they're going to be bored. So sometimes, sorry to be imprecise there. So far, I don't know that I have a main plot in Khyber Shards. I have some things that I intend to introduce to see what the players do, but so far I'm kind of just dangling bait out for the player characters and letting them choose what bait to take. The thing they have picked up on is the thing with Tommel and the Stormhammers and what Tommel is up to. And so right now we're following that path. Right now that's our main plot, as it were. When you're able to, when you have either such a great resource as all the stuff written about Stormreach to allow you to build a little sandbox, or when you can put in the work, as I have done with my One Ring campaign, to create a sandbox, that is easier because you aren't building necessarily a main plot. You're letting the player characters and the players decide which way the story will go. So yeah, sometimes when I can keep the players engaged, yes. When not, you do what you can. RA also asks, are we using any customized resurrection rules? That's a fair question, and I'm not sure. Probably to a certain extent. I tend to agree with Keith Baker that there are certain spells that are very, very uncommon outside the Dragon Marked houses. And I tend to think of Raised Dead as one of those. I tend to think of Raised Dead as something that House Jarasco has artifacts and eldritch machines that will do that, but that it's not something that just anyone can do. Now I don't have a cleric in my party. A cleric, I might make an exception for that. Maybe. I'd think about it. But I don't like death being able to be reversed simply. So when I allow the Raised Dead spell, I tend to make it a little chancier to use. Now, Revivify, different thing. Revivify is basically a defibrillator, and so, sure, why not? You know? But Raised Dead, True Resurrection, something needs to be added to give death weight, if you're going to do that. If you're going to allow that. The diamond you use has to be a super special diamond, and so you've got to go and acquire the rare black diamond of such and such place in order to successfully cast this Raised Dead spell. Or you have to deal with who's got the soul of your friend. Resurrection, any kind of resurrection, should have cost and weight to it, and not be easily available. Will that result in us using customization rules? I don't know yet. And I just haven't decided that yet. But those are my general thoughts on resurrection and death, as I think death should have weight and resurrection should not be easy or free. Or cheap. It's not free. Or cheap. And I don't think that the cost should just be cash. I understand it. Mechanically, it makes perfect sense. But I really don't like it narratively that the cost of raising someone from the dead is just having enough money to buy a diamond. That there should be something more to that. There should be story to that. So if we have a character death and we need to, and we decide we're going to try resurrection, there will be some narrative to go with it. It will not just be as simple as, boom, I cast Raised Dead and it's all fine. So again, Revivify, nah. All right. Well, those are our listener, viewer, and player questions. My dog is awake. So thank you so much for watching. One last thing. One thing that all good villains need, especially comic book villains, is villains need lieutenants. So I would like to offer you, the viewer, the opportunity to create one. Comment below with your pitch for a villainous lieutenant. If you watched my episode on factions in Stormreach, you could tell me what faction they probably belong to. But if not, pitch me an NPC. I'll take all the entries, let's say in a week. I'll take all the entries. I'll do a drawing. That seems the fair way to do it. I will do a drawing from among them, and then I'll get in touch with the winner, and we'll add their villainous lieutenant as an NPC to our Stormreach. So help me build the world. Comment below. Thank you so much. This has been Khyber Shards. Thanks for rolling with us.